the Polgar Chess University. This lesson will be real exciting. I'll show you some examples of attack or the moment when to strike. Let's get started immediately with our first example in this lesson, where we see a position just out of the opening. In fact, only 9 pair of moves have been played, and it is White's turn right now on move 10. The first thing to evaluate is the material balance, and we can see that White has sacrificed a knight, or at least is done a knight, for only 2 pawns as compensation, at least on the material end. Now, let's look further beyond the material. What do we see? White certainly is better developed in that White has already castled, and the F-file has been opened, where the White rook and queen certainly is well positioned and is pressuring Black. We can also notice that all of the Black pieces, except for the queen, are still in their initial positions, in other words, being undeveloped. Considering the fact that White is down material and the queenside pieces are also undeveloped, White needs to do something urgently, otherwise Black will get the opportunity to develop and put the king in safety. So for example, making a move like knight to c3 or developing the pawn d2 to d3 to get the bishop out would be too slow. So White needs to look for a powerful, energetic move. And I suggest you try to do that on your own before going any further. There are 2 moves that kind of meet that criteria, being ambitious. The first one would be to play queen h5 check. The good news regarding that move would be that Black has no other choice but moving the king out of the check and therefore giving up the right to castle for the rest of the game. In fact, the king can only go to d8 because after a queen h5 check, if the king goes to d7, obviously the rook would come immediately to f7, pinning the Black queen and king. However, after the king would go to d8, and if then still rook f7, then the Black queen has just 1 square to go to on e8, but that's certainly sufficient. On the other hand, Black could make also an intermediate move, playing knight to f6, counter-attacking White's queen, and then now if rook takes queen, then knight takes queen, and okay, White can get a pawn back, but it still doesn't give White an advantage. Or if the queen tries to make an intermediate check, then the king does not need to move when Black would lose the queen, but can block that check by simply interposing the pawn with b6. Okay, so let's go back all the way to the beginning. So we saw what are the possibilities happening after the queen h5 check. We can see that while White has an attack, Black seems to be hanging on just on time. So if it's not queen h5, what other energetic move does White have? Well, generally you would look at ways to attack something, either to give a check, which is a form of an attack, or attack a piece, either that's unprotected or of a higher value. Well, in this case, there is only one other move that meets that criteria, namely moving the queen to c3. And indeed, that is the correct move. Right now, the Black rook is cornered, and as the pawn on g7 is missing, Black has to face serious challenges right now. The problem is that if Black right now responds by playing e5, which is certainly a natural answer, then the White queen will check on c8, forcing the Black queen to block, and now White has number of good choices, the best one being just capturing the bishop on f8, kind of an interesting picture having all those pieces on the 8th rank, and black is losing the queen. Okay, let's go back one more time to the beginning. After queen c3, e5 therefore is pretty much out of question. But let's examine another natural move. What if the bishop comes to g7? Now, if queen c8, then queen d8, and obviously rook f8 is not a problem because the black bishop would capture the rook, not the king. And now queen captures e6. If right now the black knight would block the check, then white would simply play queen f7 and win black's bishop on g7. Therefore, black's best option is to come back with the queen to e7. And now, déjà vu, the queen arrives back to c8, forcing the queen back again to d8. And now, white has several excellent options. One is to capture the pawn on b7, when black will be forced to play either queen b6 or knight a7, but in either case, white will have 4 pawns for the knight, which is already a material advantage, or white can choose, perhaps even better, to proceed with the attack, maintaining the queens on the board by playing queen g4, attacking the bishop, and then follow up after queen e7 with the check on h5. Major difference, white won a 3rd pawn. So right now, basically, we have material balance. As we know, 3 pawns are pretty much even to a minor piece, and the attack is continuing. Black is forced to give up the right to castle. White is in excellent shape. Let's go back and see how the game continued, where after white playing queen to c3, black responded by playing knight d7, with the idea that if right now the white queen would grab the rook indeed, to trap the queen by connecting the knights, knight d to f6, and then bishop g7. Well, the point is that white is not forced to capture that rook immediately. And white found a creative way to get ahead. Try to see what you would do in this position before listening further. White continued by playing rook to f8 right now, getting rid of that very bishop that would have been the one actually attacking the queen in the corner after the queen captures the rook. The knight captured back and queen captured rook. What do we see right now? Well, as of piece is concerned, we have balance, and as of pawn concerned, white is 2 pawns ahead. So, assuming that the queen survives and black does not come up with anything immediate in counterplay, counterattacking, white should be simply winning. White's goal would be to just get that queen out of the corner, develop the pieces, and then the rest should be a piece of cake. So therefore, black continued by playing knight to f6, making sure that that queen doesn't go anywhere, at least for now. White, of course, on the other hand, needs to do everything possible to rescue that queen from the corner. And the game continued by white playing d3, protecting the pawn on one hand on e4, and more importantly, opening the diagonal of the bishop. Black responded castling to the queen's side, and as we can see right now, black is threatening to trap the queen by moving the knight away from f8 pretty much anywhere, whether to d7 or g6, the white queen will be in trouble. So what white needs to do is, white needs to bring a backup piece to support the escape of the queen, and that's exactly what white did by playing bishop to h6. Now white put a second piece controlling the key g7 square, and the good news is that there's not much that black can do against that escape of the queen. If black would move the knight from f6 to h5, for example, to control that square, that would open up the diagonal for the queen, and the queen can retreat. If the rook would move to d7 right now with the same idea, then the knight on f8 remains unprotected. So therefore, there's not much that black can do to prevent white from playing queen g7. Black played with a different plan, playing d5, trying to create a bit of a commotion on the d file and attacking the e4 pawn. White responded with the simple developing move knight c3. A very important move, gets the knight into the game as well as the rook all in one go. Now, the first rank is cleared for white's rook. There is no longer any kind of back rank checkmate, and the white rook is ready to come to the game as well. Black responded with queen c5 check, and the king moved to the corner, king h1. And now, black played knight 8 to d7, connecting the two knights, and the queen is ready for the escape, queen g7. Interestingly, black tried creatively create interesting counterplay on the king's side all of a sudden. Let's see how that worked out. Rook g8 with a tempo, queen f7, just on time, right? There's one square to escape, but one square typically is enough. Black continued with queen f2. Nice cooperation between the black rook and queen. Of course, it's important to note that if black instead would have tried to go for knight g4, trying to give the famous smothered mate, for example, after queen e6, knight f2, king g1, knight h3, double check, king h1, followed by queen g1, and the famous smothered mate, which is kind of nice dreaming, but in reality, that will not quite happen. Let's go back a bit. After queen f7, if the knight moves, the problem is white can just grab the rook with a check, and then the knight on g4. So it's important to be creative and come up with ideas, but you have to have a reality check, making sure it actually works, and it's not just a gamble. So after queen f7, the game continued with queen f2 right now, black threatening to checkmate. White has to be very careful right now. The natural move actually would give away the win. Try to think again, what should you do? If white would continue with the natural defensive move rook g1, protecting that pawn on g2, the problem is that black would be ready to save the game by a very nice little combination, sacrificing the rook on g2, with the idea that if and when rook captures on g2, black will simply give perpetual checks on f1 and f3. Let's go back to our game situation, where after queen f2, white found the only correct response, which is to play bishop g7. And this move disconnects the black rook from attacking the g2 square, the g2 pawn, and white maintains his own attack and material advantage. Black came up with another attacking plan, but this is out of desperation, and of course, in reality, it cannot work. Black played h5. This attack is too slow. White simply grabbed the pawn, h4, grabbed another pawn, h3. We can see how black desperately is trying to open up that g file, so then the queen could check the white king. But at this stage, white doesn't need to bother grabbing the pawn on h3, but will grab the knight instead with a check. Very importantly, if knight captures the pawn, then the rook is hanging. And otherwise, for example, after king b8, white could just sacrifice the queen, again with a check, extremely important, and when knight takes, promote the pawn to a queen and checkmate. A very nice game for white, and first of all, white of course showed a lot of accurate ways of attack and striking at the moment while black is still undeveloped. And then, on the other hand, white used or performed a whole bunch of accurate defensive moves. So this is kind of very typical when both sides are trying to attack, and it's a dynamic game. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. This is another interesting position when still almost all the pieces are on the board, but we can see quite easily that white is on an attack. The white queen on g6, ideally positioned with the rook helping the attack from h3, as well as the bishop aiming towards black's king side from b2. It was black's turn at the moment, and black made an inaccurate move. Black should have tried to get some defensive pieces to the king's side, such as playing maybe rook a7 and then bishop d8, so the rook from a7 could defend. But in the game, black continued by playing knight capturing on b5, with the idea to first get rid of that bishop, and then, if pawn takes back, to play queen e8. Of course, generally speaking, if you succeed to exchange your opponent's queen, the main attacking piece is gone. So, therefore, if you're on the defense, try to exchange queens of the opponent or both queens. However, the amazing part is in this case that actually white can afford not to recapture and make a peaceful and quiet move, simply bringing another piece to the attack. And the game continued with rook f1. Now white's plan is simple: to get that rook out to the third rank and at the right moment sacrifice on h6, destroying the defense near the black king, and checkmate. Let's see what would have happened right now if black continues with queen e8 as planned to exchange the queens. Of course, white would not exchange the queens, but follow up with the sacrifice. If captures, then just capture check and bring the rook out on f3, and the checkmate is coming real soon after the check on g3. Or if instead, let's go back to the position after rook f1 and queen e8 and rook h6 check, black does not capture the rook but plays king g8, then the response would be check, king f7, and at first it seems that white has nothing more than to repeat moves with queen g6 check, but reality is that white can and should play knight f3, another amazing quiet move, bringing the knight to g5 next. And I suggest you test it out, but you can figure out that black cannot save the game at this point. And let's go back to the actual game. After rook f1, black continued by playing knight d6, trying to bring the knight back to the defense, but the reality is it's too slow. White proceeds anyway with rook takes pawn, sacrificing the rook, and then, importantly, another check, making sure the king gets to the h file, and only then brings the rook out, and there's nothing black can do to prevent the upcoming checkmate. Can delay it by just one move, as black did in the game, but white simply locked up the diagonal, so the queen cannot even sacrifice on h3, and then the checkmate arrives. An interesting note that if white would right now play queen h3, things would turn out real bad for white, because not only that it's not a checkmate, but black actually would win after pinning white's king and queen. So it's quite important to play f5 instead of the immediate check on h3. Let's continue to our next example. Here we go. In this position, it is black's turn, and it is black who is on the attack. The funny thing is that black has all isolated pawns, and 5 of them, in fact, doubled pawns, 3 of them on the f-file. And this is one of those situations that, strategically speaking, white is clearly better, even though black is a pawn up. However, as we've seen in all the examples of this lesson, Using the momentum, the initiative can turn things around. And in this case is no different. Black can and needs to play very aggressively and forcefully. Again, try to take your time and figure out on your own what you would do if you would be playing with the black pieces in this position. The first powerful move is to play Queen d4, attacking the rook in the corner, as well as the rook on e1. As the f2 pawn is pinned, obviously that rook is also attacked. The only thing white can try to do is to connect the two rooks, and it seems that things are under control. However, sometimes appearances can be misleading. Black is actually in a winning position. Black continued by playing rook e8 using the pin, the fact that the white rook cannot successfully capture on e8, as then queen f2 would follow checkmate on the next move. White continued by moving the king out of the pin by playing king g1. Again, it seems that things are under control. And again, they are not. Black continued pushing the issue by playing f4. Just like in the last position, if rook takes rook now, then queen f2 and checkmate. White captured, pawn captures pawn, and queen captures pawn on f4, renewing the threat with queen captures f2. White continued with check, rook g3, king h8, threatening again with the queen f2 check, rook f1, and the final beautiful move for black, rook e1, pinning the rook and deflecting it. Black now is threatening to trade rooks and then checkmate on f2. If rook takes rook, we already know, queen takes pawn, followed by queen h2 checkmate. And for example, if rook g2, then black can simply trade rooks and then give rook d1 check and easily win. Another beautiful example on using the moment of opportunity. And let's see one more example on this theme. Here we go. This position has been played many years ago by a Hungarian grandmaster, Barca, who has been much more known for his amazing endgame skills. However, in this game he showed that if it's needed or if the opportunity is given, he can certainly be an excellent attacking player also. And in this position, white played h4, an excellent move with the idea to play h5 next to create further weaknesses on black's king side. Black responded by playing h5. It stops white's advance, however weakens the g5 square. And white responded with g4. This is kind of one of those rare situations when, despite castle into the king side, we are willing to advance our g or and h pawns. Because black is missing defensive pieces on the king side. As you can see, black does not have a fianchetto bishop on g7. It has been exchanged earlier, and neither they have a knight on f6. Black captured and came check, king g8, and followed with h5. White is not giving up, wants to open up the g and h files in front of black's king. If black does nothing, white is threatening to capture on g6, and if pawn captures back, then fork with knight e6. Another threat is to simply advance the pawn to h6 and checkmate with h7. So black continued by capturing it. Black is up 2 pawns now, but that is not what counts. The king is in trouble. Bishop e4, threatening with bishop h7, checkmate. And after the f-pawn moves, the knight is ready to fork, jump into e6. Queen e8, and now white could win either rook actually, but much better is even to play queen d2 to follow up with the attack that caused black to resign. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. As usual, I suggest you take your time and figure out what's the story here. It's black's move. Is it a draw? Is white winning? What's the story? The answer to that question is white is winning. If the king moves back, the solution is simple. Rook a6, check, and if bishop blocks, white can either take the bishop or the rook first and then the other and win. But what about if black is tricky and moves to f4? If now rook takes rook, then bishop takes rook in the corner and we reach a theoretical drawn endgame. Or if rook takes bishop, king e3. Look at that. Now white seems to be in real trouble, being threatened to get checkmated with rook h1 as well as the rook is hanging. The typical pattern that you may have seen in some endgame study, to give the rook up and then to try to skewer the black rook, does not quite work because the king is close enough to the rook. However, the point is, after king f4, rook takes king e3, that white still has the right to castle, and therefore can castle queenside and connect the rooks. A true jewel composed by Cohn in 1940. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed these wonderful attacking examples, and be back next week for some more chess ideas. Bye-bye.